Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third day of the UFAW International Animal Welfare Conference. My name is Hugh Gollidge and I'm Chief Executive of UFAW, and it's a pleasure to be welcoming over 500 people to the final day of this conference. Steve, can you flip over to the next slide?
Yes.
If you're following us on social media and posting about the conference, please use the hashtag UFAW 2025. We've seen some really great posts on LinkedIn over the last few days, so please keep that up. And you can also follow us on Blue Sky, and we'll keep an eye on all the other social media channels as well. Next slide, please, Steve. I've told you at the introductions of this conference a little bit about UFAW, so I don't need to do that anymore. If you just skip to the next slide, Steve. And again, just a little note about our journal. Sorry, you've gone one too far, Steve. We've been hearing lots of fantastic research presented today. Some of that you won't have published yet. If you'd like to publish that in a really high quality animal welfare journal, please consider submitting your research to our journal, Animal Welfare. We've just heard this year's impact factor, which has gone up 60% over last year. So this is a journal that's definitely on the up in terms of its impact since it went open access. So we really do believe that this is genuinely one of the best places to publish your animal welfare science. So have a look at the journal's webpage and consider submitting your research if you would like to. Next slide, please, Steve. We've also heard, particularly yesterday, about the need for not just doing really high quality animal welfare science, but making sure it gets out into the world and has a real world impact on things like policy. So I'd really encourage you to take a look at the seminar series we're running with our friends at the Animal Welfare Research Network on translating animal welfare research into law and policy. We've got a seminar next week from a former UK Secretary of State for Agriculture, and then there's a whole lot more seminars planned for the autumn, and you can also watch the recordings. So that's a really good place to get some tips on how to really advocate for having your excellent work that we've been hearing about over the last couple of days taken account in policy. So yeah, again, follow those links. We'll share all of these links at the end to make sure that you've got them if you didn't get a chance to catch them during our introductions. And finally, I think for my introduction this morning, I'll just remind you that we'll be holding an in-person conference, but also streamed as well for those who can't attend in London next summer, which will be our centenary conference. So please keep that as a date in your diary. We'll send you the confirmed dates very shortly, and we'll hope to see lots of you in London next year. So with that very quick introduction, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Beate Nielsen, who's chairing the first session today.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Yes, welcome to the third and final day of the UFAW conference. My name is Beate Nielsen. I'm Research Director at UFAW, and I'll be chairing the first session. And my first task is to introduce the winner of the UFAW Medal for Outstanding Contributions to Animal Welfare Science. Steve, I don't know if you can put up a slide so we can see who I'm talking about. So it has already been announced in the spring that Ngaio Beausoleil, who is a professor of animal welfare science at the School of Veterinary Sciences at Massey University in New Zealand, and also a co-director of their Animal Welfare Science and Bioethics Center. And since obtaining her PhD, Ngaio has worked on a number of subjects pertaining to the welfare of animals, but there are two in particular that stands out. And one is the development and promotion of the 5 domains with Professor David Meller, who happens to be a former recipient of the UFAW medal. And although these are sometimes referred to as Mellor's 5 domains, Ngaio's input has been a major reason for their adoption worldwide, and I think it's time that she gets acknowledged for her role in this. Another subject that Ngaio has worked on is euthanasia, if I could pronounce it, killing and wildlife control methods. Now, the subject of humane death and methods to eradicate unwanted species are highly sensitive and often controversial, and this is something that Ngaio has worked with for a number of years and done very, very well. And in addition to these two areas, Ngaio has worked on conservation welfare, so the welfare impacts associated with wildlife conservation activities. And she has also worked on the evaluation and alleviation of pain in farm animals. So she's very, very stringent in her scientific approach, and paired with her compassion for animal welfare science, this makes her an outstanding researcher and communicator. Her work has been cited over 4,400 times, I believe. So these are the reasons why Ngaio Beausoleil receives the 2025 UFAW Medal for Outstanding Contributions to Animal Welfare Science. So congratulations, Ngaio, and we look forward to hearing your talk. Thank you.
Hi everyone, such a pleasure to be here speaking with you today. What I'd like to do over the next 20 or so minutes is give you a sense of what I've had the privilege of thinking about and working on for about the last 25 years. And when I look back over that time, a theme that really emerges for me is this idea of dissecting distress. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. Within this, I'd like to talk about three interrelated topics. The first is explorations of negative experiences, particularly those qualities of negative experience that are not pain. The second is structured approaches to validating animals' capacity to have specific qualities of experience and teaching those structured approaches. And the third also relates to teaching. This is really about some of our more recent explorations of problems that relate to animal welfare that persist even though we understand them quite well, and the human systems that create and maintain those problems. In my career, and particularly in the early part of my career, I did quite a lot of work on pain in animals. But when I look back across the last 25 years, I see this major theme emerging, which is a particular interest in exploring negative affects or negative affective experiences other than pain. And this is the work that I get really excited about. Before I get into the detail of that, I want to start by making my philosophy of animal welfare clear. And I think it's important to understand your own philosophy and to be able to articulate that position clearly to others. So everything that I talk about today is predicated on the view that animal welfare is a state within the animal itself. That welfare state relates to how the animal itself experiences its life. And if you take this view, it's mainly the affective outcomes of the animal's physical state and its perceptions of its environment that matter. You'll hear me talk about affects or affective experiences, and what I mean by that is simply mental experiences that matter to the animal. They have a valence. They have a feeling of being good or pleasurable or bad or unpleasant to the animal. Now, as you can imagine, there's a key challenge with this approach. The thing that we care about most, those affective experiences, are not directly available for us to study. These experiences are subjective and they are internal, and therefore they are not available for direct observation or measurement. And that means that we can only ever infer these mental experiences from the things that we can observe and measure. So in theory, various qualities of negative or unpleasant experience are acknowledged, and this is just an example shown using the 5 domains here. And that acknowledgement is by both lay people, but also by scientists. However, if you really look at what's happened over the last 60 years in our work in animal welfare science as a discipline, you can see that there is still a strong focus on the presence or the absence of pain in our research, in policy, and in associated practice. I want to give you 3 examples of this kind of enduring focus on pain. So the first one here at the top on the left, might be your right, is some wording from the New Zealand Animal Welfare Act. And you'll see here this explicit focus on pain. So this says that the owner of an animal or a person in charge of the animal has an obligation to alleviate pain and some other things. The second example is on the other side here, this list of criteria, and this is from Lynn Snedden and colleagues. And really the point I want to make here is that the capacity to have the emotional component or the emotional experience of pain is nearly universally used as a threshold for deciding which animals are sentient and thus have welfare states to consider, and in some places have protection under the law. If we go back to the other side in the blue table at the bottom there, this is an example from research, and this is my very quick and very unscientific survey of the published literature. But what you see here is that between 10 and 100 times more papers are published that relate to pain in animals, or specifically in relation to animal welfare, than on other qualities of negative experience. And I've just selected a couple here. So there are really legitimate reasons for this focus. However, I would actually argue that there's value in focusing our scientific attention on other qualities of negative affective experience as well. And Jonathan Birch put this nicely when he said, in relation to those criteria that are presented for pain by Lynn Snedden and others, there's a need for us to develop similar lists of criteria with respect to other dimensions of subjective experience, so things like suffering, anxiety, and fear. I would actually go one further, and I'd argue that we need to be more specific in our terminology and our investigations. So we see these kinds of terms coming up, or these concepts coming up in lots of different places. We see mention of pain and distress, or pain and suffering. And I think the aim of using these kinds of collections of terms are to make sure that we cover all of the negative bases in addition to pain. I would argue actually that the reality of using these kind of catch-all terms, things like distress and suffering, is problematic for a number of reasons. So if we think about it, these terms represent some version of one or more qualities of negative experience. So we might be thinking, in addition to pain, about things like fear, nausea, breathlessness, hunger, even things like loneliness, perhaps. But if you think about it, these are experiences that have different causes. They represent different problems for the animal, and so they have different solutions. And so the question really arises of, how do we recognize distress? How do we recognize suffering? If these represent different problems based on their primary cause, then we would expect to have different indicators relating to the animal trying to solve those specific problems, or fix those specific feelings, or attend to those specific warnings. So the question really arises, what indicators could we use for these catch-all terms to recognize distress or to recognize suffering? Similarly, the problem arises, how do we fix those problems? How do we prevent or alleviate them from occurring if we lump all of them together into these catch-all terms? In addition to those problems, lumping them, everything but pain, together as things like distress or suffering, I think risks us underemphasizing the importance of other significant negative experiences, things that are unpleasant but are not pain. We risk failing to look for or to recognize evidence that those other negative experiences are occurring. And I think we risk falling into this no pain, no problem trap. So I want to give you a brief explanation of how I came to start exploring negative experiences other than pain. About 25 years ago, I was asked by my then PhD supervisor, David Mellor, to teach into his animal welfare course. And I was asked specifically to teach the component on respiratory physiology. When I looked at the notes of the previous guest lecturer, I discovered that that person had been talking about respiratory physiology in the context of high altitude. And what I wanted to do was find a topic to teach respiratory physiology to the students in a way that was more relevant to animal welfare. And that led me to explorations of the use of different gases for stunning or for killing animals, controlled atmosphere stunning, and thinking about the affective experiences that might relate to disruptions or changes in respiration in that situation. So these are experiences that would definitely be unpleasant because they would serve as warnings to the animal that something was disrupted or had changed in a problematic way. And so those experiences would affect the animal's welfare if they were happening, but they were very obviously different from the quality of experience of pain. And so after 10 long years of working on it, I finally organized to get a paper published on this in 2015. So don't give up if you've been working on something for a really long time. And this was a review that drew together our theoretical understanding of unpleasant experiences that relate to respiration. We presented evidence that other mammals might be having similar or might be capable of similar experiences. And on the basis of that understanding, we speculated on a variety of different conditions or situations in which those experiences might arise. And just suffice it to say that there are actually quite a few. Experiences like breathlessness and pain and hunger and others can be considered to be what we call survival critical affects or experiences. And so these represent some kind of internal disruption or an imbalance or a change to homeostasis occurring within the animal. And the warnings that those experiences represent are important because if the animal doesn't attend to them, if they are not effective in resolving the problem that those warnings represent, then they're likely to die. There are other qualities of mental experience that are not survival critical, and we refer to these ones as situation related. These are other qualities that are presumed to be negative, and one of those might be boredom. So these kinds of situation-related experiences are even more challenging to investigate scientifically for a number of reasons. The first is, as the name suggests, rather than relating to some kind of internal problem or an imbalance physiologically, these relate to the animal's, the individual animal's perceptions of the situation in which it finds itself. And if we look at the human literature, we find that even in humans, some of these experiences are poorly defined and they're poorly understood in terms of the mechanisms underlying their generation. Another challenge that we have is that within a certain kind of animal or within people, among individuals, there is great variation in the source or the cause of the experience that's generated. So this is really easy to demonstrate. I'm not at all bored right now as I'm talking about this, but you might be bored out of your head. And so say that we have the same situation or the same conditions, but quite different perceptions and therefore different effective outcomes happening in that situation. And related to this, we can have animals living in conditions that we expect would give rise to feelings like boredom, and they don't die. And they may even maintain excellent health and productivity. So we have this challenge of not really being able to use indicators of the animal's biological function or physical state as representations of the likelihood of these kinds of negative experiences like boredom arising. And that makes it really difficult to identify indicators. There are some other situation-related affects that are similar in regard to the difficulty of validating their occurrence, so things like frustration, loneliness, anxiety, depression, for example, and some of the same challenges are likely to apply when we try to validate positive experiences. So you might have noticed on this slide that this person up in the corner is not me. This is one of our recent PhD students, Morgan Heslop. And Morgan came to us as a group of potential supervisors and said, I would like to do my PhD on boredom. And we said, no way, Jose, we're not doing it. It's too difficult. We're not sure how to even begin looking at that. So please go away. But luckily, Morgan is not only a brilliant scientist, but she's also very persistent and she wouldn't go away. And so she undertook her PhD research on boredom and how we might recognize and validate its occurrence. She went about doing this by scouring the human psychology literature on boredom, and from that she identified a number of internal and environmental factors that seem to be related to boredom in humans. And from there she developed a model that considers those factors in order to be able to predict animals' behavioral responses to those situations and the likely effective outcomes. And the real value of this piece of work that Morgan has completed is that it will allow us to design future research to better interrogate the occurrence of boredom when it might be occurring. I'd like to now take a step to the side and talk about frameworks for scientifically validating some of these mental experiences that we're interested in. So for the last 5 years, my colleagues and I have been teaching into our area of expertise. We have a new degree that has an animal welfare major, and this is quite exciting. But obviously, when you have to teach something, you need to understand it thoroughly. And what I've discovered is that there's often a need to create or to refer to an underlying framework for the ideas that you want the students to understand. And so in this case, in our animal welfare science paper, we wanted our third year students to have a structured method that they could use for evaluating animals' capacity to have the emotion of pain and other qualities, particularly of negative experiences. And so the framework that we've decided to present to our students, largely for the sake of simplicity, is one that's based on 4 types of evidence. In class, we use pain as a model to teach this process. And when we look at the criteria that are used to try to understand our ability to infer the pain experience in animals, you'll see it's the same kinds of evidence presented in Snedden's criteria and others lists. It's just arranged a bit differently. And the reason for that is really what we're aiming for is a more generalized process. So we don't want this to be limited to just understanding pain. We also want to create something that we could use for students to understand how they can support their inferences of other experiences, hopefully at some stage both negative and positive. So the 4 types of evidence that we get the students to work through are first starting off from our own perspective, which we want to do. So looking at human report of experiences when people are exposed to similar situations or stimuli. We also look at the machinery in the animal of interest. So do they have some kind of homologous machinery, the same kind of machinery, and I mean the anatomy, the physiology, the neural pathways and activation of those pathways. Or do they have some other machinery that might do the same or a similar job? The third thing we look at is the expression of specific protective responses, and these are behavioral or physiological, by the animal during or after exposure. And then the fourth category is what happens when we apply approaches or strategies that are known to relieve or prevent reports of that affective experience in humans. And then if we apply those to animals, do we see changes in those behavioral and physiological responses? And so within the third and fourth categories, we present the students with a hierarchy of evidence. So particularly for behavioral evidence, we want the students to be able to differentiate between weak behavioral evidence of the emotional experience happening all the way through to stronger evidence. And so at the weak end, we have things like reflexive responses. So those might be behavioral and physiological responses that we would see the animal perform even if it was anesthetized, for example, or if parts of its nervous system were disrupted, and you would see those responses performed nonetheless. That's weak evidence that the animal is necessarily having the emotional experience, for example, of pain. At the other end of our continuum, where we have stronger evidence, we're looking at things like behavioral responses that support learning having occurred, the involvement of memory, or the flexibility of the response depending on what else is going on for the animal at the time. And the point here really is we're looking for evidence that reflects the involvement of higher or integrative centers that might also be responsible or capable of generating the affective experience, so the pain part, for example. Our hope is that this kind of framework would be more broadly applicable, so not just useful for pain, but also for validating the inference of other negative and potentially positive affects as well. And so what we get the students to do towards the end of the course is to use that framework to organize the available evidence for inferring a specific negative experience, that being breathlessness, in a specific type of animal, that being birds. And we asked them to do that in the context of birds being exposed to gases that have higher concentrations of carbon dioxide than normal air, hypercapnic gases. And so here you just see a summary that we get the students to develop. They can demonstrate in blue the level of confidence in each of those categories, and then also noted in red here are areas where there is weak evidence. There are key benefits to taking this kind of structured approach. Importantly, we're able to demonstrate our confidence in the inferences that we're making. Or in other words, we can show the strength of the supporting evidence for those inferences. And this is really important. This transparency is really important for being credible in our welfare assessments. The other thing that's valuable is that where the evidence is weak, we can highlight those knowledge gaps, and that allows us to direct our future research efforts to improve the strength of the supporting evidence or our confidence in those inferences. Of course, there are still limitations. So really importantly, this kind of approach relies inherently on comparison to humans. We can't help it. That's always our starting point. And sometimes we don't even understand the underlying mechanisms, the affective neuroscience very well in humans. The other challenges are that we run the risk of anthropomorphism. So we see an animal doing something, it looks like what we would do, and so we automatically assume that the animal feels the same way we do in a similar situation. However, we also run the risk of anti-anthropomorphism. So animals that have different ways of solving similar problems or that look very different from us, we might assume that they don't have the capacity for experiences that we have, or we can't even imagine what it might be like for them in those situations. The other limitation that emerges when you try to apply this for specific affective experiences is that it only works really well in its current form for those survival critical negative affective experiences. And that's for some of the reasons that I explained when I was talking about boredom. Validating inferences of mental experiences is a really difficult thing to do, but it's important for us to keep developing transparent and structured approaches to doing this work. And I think this is critical to being able to credibly apply theoretical models for assessing animal welfare states when those models rely on inferences of mental experiences to understand those welfare states. So anybody can claim that an animal of a particular type is having an affect of a particular type, but unless someone has done this kind of science homework to support those inferences, it's impossible for us to argue against criticisms of anthropomorphism. And the risk, I think, is that as a discipline for animal welfare and for animal welfare science, we lose credibility unless we're able to respond to those kinds of criticisms. And this is something that Kat Littlewood is going to talk about further later on in the session, and she'll talk about the risks associated with welfare washing if we don't do our science homework well. The final thing I want to talk about today is some of the recent developments we've had in our teaching team, looking at not just the science of animal welfare, but also the human aspects of animal welfare problems, and particularly taking a systems thinking approach. As I've indicated throughout this talk, there's still lots to learn using animal welfare science and many problems to interrogate. But there are also lots of animal welfare issues that we understand really well from a science point of view, but that persist nonetheless. And this can be quite frustrating and sometimes confusing because we think, you know, we've done the science, we understand what the problem is here, why hasn't it been fixed? And so stemming from my own frustration and confusion about that, we really wanted to help the next generation of animal welfare thinkers understand some of those other or broader factors, so the social, the legal, the economic, and human behavior kind of factors that create and maintain some of these complex problems or dilemmas. So in our third year paper, which is called Dilemmas in Animal Welfare, one of the cases that we have selected for exploring these complex systems is breeding for extreme conformation. And we haven't just focused on one kind of dog or one kind of conformational problem, because it's the system of extreme breeding that really creates these issues, these animal welfare issues. So this is one of the ones we've selected because it has all of the hallmarks of a complex self-maintaining system. And those include that there is a welfare issue that's perceived by at least one party to be important, and that problem is familiar and it's well understood. We know a lot about the science behind some of these welfare problems. The system involves many different stakeholders who are very interconnected, and those stakeholders prioritize different interests or values with regard to the dogs and the practice. This leads them to have different views on what is the right way to act. There are lots of different things that could be done, and one of the challenges is it's not always clear what will happen if you choose to act in a particular way because of that interrelatedness. So because of these features, these are problems that are difficult to change, and that there have been unsuccessful attempts to solve these problems. One of the things that we want the students to understand is the different kinds of change that are possible, and we want them to come away from the course having an understanding of what the possible actions they could take might be and how they could contribute to changing these kinds of systems as scientists or in other roles that they might choose to take in the future. Well, I've probably run out of time now, so just a brief summary. The first thing I want to say is that there's still much to explore and to validate, even just for negative experiences, before we even start thinking about positives. And that's always good news, because it means for people like us, we still have jobs. I would really encourage you in your careers to think about the tricky questions. Don't shy away from things that are difficult. There's never going to be a perfect way of doing things, but the more that people engage with these challenges and have a go, the further we get together. I am a big fan of using a structured approach, and I think it's really important to be transparent. People might not agree with the way you've done it, but at least they can see what you've done, they can build on it, and they can come up with an appropriate critique, and we can then work on the problem as a collective. The other thing I would say is work with lots of amazing people. I've had an unbelievable sort of run of wonderful experiences working with very talented and skilled people who can do things that I can't do, and it's been an utter pleasure. And I think it's really valuable to understand things more broadly than just the science of animal welfare. So understand the human systems and the behavior so that we can find levers to changing some of those problems that are persistent and significant for animals. And then the final thing I want to leave you with is get yourself in the room. We need people with specific expertise in animal welfare and the science of animal welfare in the room at the right time. There's a sort of a global movement right now to exclude experts, scientific experts, from discussions that might be politically inconvenient, but I would really encourage you to get yourself there to really advocate for scientific approaches to understanding these welfare problems. So the only thing left to say is ngā mihi nui, a huge thanks to everyone for having me here to speak today. There are some colleagues in New Zealand that I would like to give sincere thanks to, as well as our students. And a big thank you to all of my wonderful international colleagues. It's been such an unbelievable privilege. Thank you.
Oops, a slightly abrupt ending here, but I think we got the message. Thank you very much, Ngaio. If you could turn your camera and microphone on now and take some questions, that would be lovely. There you are. Welcome, Ngaio, in live from New Zealand. I know that it's about 7:30 in the evening where you are, so thank you for taking the time to answer a few questions. And they're coming in hard and fast. The first one is from Baz Rodenberg, who says, congratulations on your award, Ngaio. Inspiring talk.
Thank you.
Are you in favor of considering affective states separately, or do you also find it useful to add up either positive or negative affective states, for instance, combining physical and mental pain?
Oh, that feels like more than one question mixed in together. We have done some work attempting to amalgamate positive and negative experiences to come up with some kind of global understanding of an animal's welfare state at a particular point in time, and it is very difficult. So I don't know, Baz, if I have an answer for that, but I think it's a worthy question, and I'd love to know if other people have answers to that part. With regard to the physical and, was it physical and mental pain?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I wonder. I've heard the term social pain. I've heard pain used in ways that is not related to the kind of nociceptive pain that we automatically think about. So where we see specific sensory receptors that are activated because of tissue injury or inflammation, for example, that then lead to that kind of what we might regard as being physically derived pain. I don't know very much about the mechanisms of other kinds of pain. So I wonder whether we mean pain or do we mean something else there? So I'd love to be able to throw those questions back to people and see what other people think
Excellent.
about them.
Yes. Linking onto that, there's a question here from Hugh Gollidge. He's asking why pain as a negative experience is focused on so much. Is it because it's easier for us to empathize with animals in pain than, for instance, feeling breathlessness or nausea?
I had a whole slide on that and I had to take it out because I didn't have enough time. So thanks, Hugh. I didn't even set him up for that. One of the things that we do is we ask the students to talk about that. So we get them to brainstorm and say, why is pain our threshold or our metric for sentience? Why are we kind of saying that in order for an animal to have welfare to consider, it has to be able to experience pain? And the students came up with 10 different reasons. So it's things like, if we just restrict ourselves to physical pain for a moment, it's things like we understand the physiology and the neurophysiology really quite well compared to other kinds of negative experiences. So we know what the receptors are, we know what the pathways are, we know how this information goes up to the mammalian brain at least, and where centers in the brain that create negative experiences lie, and what the pain matrix looks like in the brain. But there are other less sort of sciencey reasons as well. I think because we know what it feels like. It's always unpleasant. We have lots of different words to describe pain. So there are a whole number of really legitimate reasons. The other ones the students came up with are things like, we do lots of things to animals that cause tissue damage and therefore are likely to cause pain. And that's another reason that we put this real sort of, I suppose, emphasis on pain as the thing that animals must be able to experience for us to worry about them. So they did a great job when we asked them about that.
Yes, I'm really fascinated by the way you talk about teaching. We don't discuss teaching animal welfare science enough, I think. So this has been great.
I agree.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you very much, Ngaio. Congratulations again.
Thank
and
you.
Such a pleasure to hear your talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Can I remind everybody to type their questions into the question box and to visit the posters? You can find the link either in one of the messages in the Slack or in the abstract booklet form. The next speaker today is Ishaya Gadzama, who is going to talk about virtual fencing.
Hello, everyone. Good day. My name is Ishaya Gadzama, and today I'll be presenting on a topic that says, from wires to wireless, can virtual fencing improve animal welfare? So this study was conducted in collaboration with some of my mentees in the person of Holiness, Kazal, and Emmanuel. So by way of introduction, virtual fencing is an alternative to traditional fencing, and it's an innovative technology that uses global positioning systems such as the GPS-enabled collars with auditory/electrical cues, and sensory. These sensory signals manage livestock without the need of physical barriers. And this technology has gained significant attention in the area of livestock management because of its potential benefit of ecological conservation and cost reduction. So it's a dynamic system of cattle management, and it's emerging, especially with the current issues with animal welfare. So the aim of the study was to study or to characterize the state of the art regarding the use of virtual fencing as an innovative tool for modern cattle management. And the objectives of the study were to explore technological foundations of virtual fencing system and to review research on animal learning and behavioral adaptation and assessing how cattle respond to virtual boundaries over time. And we also evaluated animal welfare implication as a result of using these virtual fencing devices. So table 1 shows the commercial virtual fencing system that are currently in use for cattle management. And we have highlighted about four systems or 4 devices that are used for the monitoring of cattle on the grazing land. And they are no fence, e-shepherd, halter, and the vents. These are their manufacturers, and the application of these devices or these technologies are for rotational grazing, conservation of riparian areas, that is areas that are situated along the banks of rivers and streams and other water bodies that are prevented from overgrazing. And these virtual fencing technologies also are used for large-scale pasture management and for intensive dairy farming, especially for milking, parlour, and herding. So this is the illustration of some of these virtual fence devices that we reviewed in our study. And I want to sound a disclaimer that I'm not working for any of these manufacturers. So this illustration is only for research purposes. This is the no fence technology. The no fence technology is having both collars for cattle and also for small ruminant, that is sheep and goat. And this is the illustration of the ones for the sheep. You can see how it is. The sheep collar are usually lighter in weight compared to the ones for the cattle. And this is the e-shepherd for cattle. And you can see here how they are positioned or how they are mounted on the animal. And the next one is the halter. So the halter system is also a very, innovative way of, monitoring cattle on grazing paddock. And they have the solar panel that has opportunity or ability to recharge the batteries. And this is another VF technology called the VENS, developed in the United States. And it has also sensor or GPS sensors that communicate remotely with the farmer. So how does the virtual fencing work? So the virtual fencing technology works by having different features. So some of the features, we have the GPS here, we have the cloud where information are stored. We have these systems whereby the farmer set the virtual boundaries on the laptop or on his tablet or handset for monitoring activity of the cattle on the paddock. So these cattle are allowed to graze in a particular delineated area, and this is warning zone 1, warning zone 2, and this implies that when the cattle is about to cross this zone, the cattle receives an auditory cue or a sound that warns the cattle not to cross. But when the cattle ignore this sound at this stage, it moves to the next boundary. The cattle will receive an electric pulse. Then the electric pulse is usually around 0.2 to 3 kilovolts of electric pulse. That is if the cattle ignores the initial auditory pulse, auditory cues of 82 decibel, around 5 to 20 seconds. So The working of this virtual fencing is simply that the virtual fencing enables the the farmer to set an invisible background or boundary. And when cattle approach this predefined limit, the collar emits auditory warnings, followed by a mild electric volt. And then there are two stages of learning. That is, number one is that the cattle learn by associative learning, which means that the cattle associate the electric and auditory cues to allow the animal to turn back. So operant conditioning is another kind of or type of associative learning whereby the cattle learns to retreat on its own without having to pass through the electric poles. And some animals also learn through social facilitation or social learning, whereby they learn from their cord specific. So if another cattle receives an electric pulse and the other cord specific observe how it turns away from the boundary, so the other animal will not go near that boundary because they have been given a warning through their conspecific. So that's how the virtual fencing works in general, but this is just a general overview. More details in our research work, which was published this year in May. So as an illustration, I just wanted to show us how the virtual fencing boundary are set in real life. So these white lines or on the field is not visible to the animals, but the farmer sets it on their tablet or on their computer, and the animals are kept within this boundary until if they try or attempt to cross this white line, which is virtual, then they receive an audio warning, that is an audio cue, a sound. But if they refuse and they proceed further, there will be another boundary around here, which the animal will receive an electric pulse, like I've explained earlier. So in this respect, the efficacy of virtual fencing depends on the animal species, and it also depends on the virtual fencing technology used, and especially it also depends on the durability of the device, especially withstanding weather condition. So the containment rate varies between 95% to about 99%, as shown on this table. And the containment rate is compared with the one of the traditional or electric fence. And electric fence usually contain the animal about 100% of the time. But you can see even in some studies like the one by Verdon et al. 2021 in lactating dairy cows, about 99% containment rate were achieved, which is similar to the electric fence. There are other welfare issues that were noted, but they were only identified during the training period. But as the animal get used to the technology, they avoid receiving the electric pulse, which now reduces the impact on their welfare. So typically, cattle learn to adapt to the virtual fence technology between 3 to 12 days of training. And this table 3 shows the cross section, cross species comparison of the behavioral and welfare outcome of virtual fencing depending on the duration of the study, the technology used, the behavioral effect investigated, and the welfare. So in terms of the welfare, the virtual fencing technology and the electric fencing technology are similar in terms of animal welfare implication, because the fecal cortisol metabolite that were measured in some study, they remain within the same level with the ones of the electric fence, which shows that there is no significant effect of virtual fencing, even though they receive electric pulse, but that did not spike their fecal cortisol level. And in another study by Lagworthy et al. 2021, the authors reported that temporary male cortisol spike happened around day 5, but no long-term effect on animal welfare. And then when we look at the cost comparison between virtual fencing technology and the conventional fencing technology, initially virtual fencing technology has higher costs, but the long-term sustainability of this technology outperform the traditional fencing because it does not require maintenance costs. Like the virtual fencing technology doesn't require maintenance costs as with the traditional or conventional fencing that requires intensive labor, maintenance costs, and sometimes the flexibility is not there, it's not flexible, but the farmer using virtual fencing technology can adjust the grazing location or the grazing site of their animal on the paddock virtually without the labor of going physically to adjust the fence. So the virtual fencing technology is largely suitable for large-scale operation for tech-savvy farmers, but small farmers with low budget usually stick to the conventional fence. But there's no big rule in saying that they cannot also use the virtual fence. It depends on their capacity. So the challenges regarding this virtual fencing technology has been highlighted from our literature review, and we discovered that GPS and connectivity issues are among the challenges, especially in rugged terrain, in areas where there are poor network or rural areas like regional areas, and sometimes winter period or short daylight short sunlight period can affect the functionality of this technology because they reuse solar panel to charge or to recharge the batteries. So if this environment do not have sufficient sunlight and the weather is not favorable, then it will affect the functionality or the connectivity of the technology. And also in regard to reliability, batteries sometimes do not last longer because of poor charging or because of insufficient sunlight to recharge them. So therefore, the collars are having some initial, lack of battery sustainability. And also detachment and malfunctioning of the collars can happen. Sometimes the collars might fall off the neck of the cow or of the cattle or of the beef cattle, and then the farmer needs to retrieve those collars, reset them, and then redeploy them on the animal. So those are some of the challenges that farmers may face while using virtual fencing technology. Another challenge is the issue of welfare, and the initial stress during the learning period is, as I've highlighted earlier, is another factor to be considered because some animals, there are individual differences in animal learning. Some animals learn faster than other animals, like it has been shown in sheep. Sheep learn, goat learn to adapt to virtual fencing more than sheep. So most of the research reported that sheep learn faster than, goat learn faster than sheep. So in terms of behavioral and physical impact, some short-term behavioral disruption can occur during this virtual fencing technology process by reducing lying time of the animal. Occasional color aberration can occur in dairy cattle, which means that the technology needs to be adjusted in order not to cause any physical harm to the animal. And other challenges regarding ethical perception, some farmers perceive that even though it is very less electric volt that is used to give the warning to the animal, they still feel that there are welfare issues or welfare concerns regarding that. So there is need for developing the optimizing the virtual fencing technology or devices so that the animal will need to learn without having to go through the electric pulse. And in conclusion, virtual fencing can improve animal welfare with proper training and specific technology. Virtual fencing does not negatively affect milk production or composition, and as well as virtual fencing offers cost savings, ecological benefit, improve animal welfare, but technological and ethical challenges need to be addressed for broader use. As the technology advances, more research is conducted. Virtual fencing technology has the potential to become a standard tool for livestock management, offering more sustainable practices for farmers. So gaps identified in the study include there are not enough research on the best materials to use for virtual fencing, and also there is no
Thank you, Ishaya. I'm not quite sure how the talk ended a little bit abruptly, but I think we got your concluding remarks. Thank you for joining us live here to take some questions. One question from Eleanor Nallen is, how aversive are these electrical pulses?
Thank you for that question. So the electrical pulses, because as I explained in my presentation, they are not very aversive to the animals, though at the initial training period, like which lasts basically from 3 to 12 days, the animals, because they are exposed, like every novel tool or every novel thing that an animal is exposed to, they usually have this fear, and even human beings, it happens to us when we are exposed to a novel environment. We have this kind of heightened cortisol level. So at the initial training stage, the technology seems to be aversive, but later in the period of the experiment, it has been shown that the, the dairy animals or beef cattle adapt to those technology. So it's the electric pulse is the major concern there, but the electric pulse is basically at a very short duration of time, between 5 seconds to a maximum of 20 seconds. So that is one of the reasons what motivated us to conduct that research here. So.
But I'll take the prerogative of the chair to ask the question about individual differences, because this is all about animal welfare today, and there are animals that learn it quickly and therefore do not get a lot of shocks. That's fine. But then in some of the results you showed, there are animals that find it more difficult to learn. You said some of them need more training. Do the farmers have the time to do that? What happens with those animals?
Yeah, so one of the challenges in the virtual fencing training period, like you mentioned, is individual differences or individual variation in the learning period. So that is where the associative learning or the social learning comes into place. So it has been shown from our research or from our findings that some animals learn to adapt to the virtual fencing technology by associative learning or by the social learning, whereby like it has been shown previously, animals that were previously exposed to any sort of fencing tend to adapt quickly to the virtual fence technology as compared to animals that have never been exposed to any kind of fencing, or whether electric fencing or the physical structures. So so the farmer can improve on that by probably I will speculate here, because it's based on research. It is established that there are individual learning differences, but that is where we suggest further research, long-term studies, whereby farmers need to now see what they can do to improve the rate of learning within the first 12 days of the training period. And probably to increase the learning period, probably they need to expose the animals to more days of training. And another thing that we are considering based on our findings is to reduce the electric pulse so that it will not be aversive to the animals.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Ishaya, for answering the questions. It was nice to hear your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Our third talk in this morning's or afternoon or evening session is from Fay Clark from University of Bristol, who will talk about all fun and games.
Hello, my name is Fay Clark, and my UFAW conference talk is about play and how we can push enrichment from being something fun and frivolous to being something more serious by providing animals with rule-based challenges. I've always loved working in animal welfare science because it's such a diverse field with lots of people coming from different disciplines and crossing over. So my disciplinary crossover is with animal cognition. I actually began my career in pure animal cognition. And even looking back at that time when I was testing animal cognitive skills, I was always struck by the emotional responses that animals can have when they're participating in different challenges. So when it came time to do my PhD, I knew that I wanted to study cognitive enrichment because I was interested in how animals respond to these challenges. As a 30-second summary of what's to come in this talk, I'm going to start with the status quo and how when we do cognitive enrichment tasks, what we usually do is we separate out if and when the animal's using the task and then what happens afterwards. So we have this separation between task use and then the welfare indicators like play. What I'm going to do is suggest that we combine these two things, so the red and the blue are going to make the purple, and we think about how the animal is developing its skills by playing with the task. That means we're moving from a bottom-up approach where play is a universal welfare indicator and we take quite a coarse behavioural focus, to something more top-down. Play is the mechanism by which skills develop, and we're going to take a focus on affective state. So obviously this talk is all about cognitive enrichment, so I should start with a definition. This was the definition that I proposed as part of my PhD research about 15 years ago. So at the time I said that cognitive enrichment is a task or tasks whose use is associated with two things happening simultaneously. So the first is the cognitive bit. That would be an engagement of some cognitive skills, for example, problem solving and something to do with environmental control. And then simultaneously what you need to have to actually prove that this is enriching is an increase in one or more welfare indicators. As you can see, this definition was left open and quite broad so that it didn't restrict too many people's trying it from an applied perspective. There's tons of rationale in the literature about why we want our captive animals to face challenges, so you can definitely find a lot of this in the literature. I'm going to summarise it really quickly. There's broadly three branches of this research. The first branch is looking at the fact that animals seem to be motivated to seek out challenge, so it means something to them inherently. Then there's the benefits that happen when the animal is actually facing the challenge, and this is the type of research that I'm interested in. And then there's the long-term impacts of cognitive challenge. What happens to the animal after many months or even years across its lifespan? This is a picture of a chimpanzee interacting with a piece of cognitive enrichment. Again, this is going back to my doctoral research, but I've been doing more or less the same type of cognitive challenge tasks for animals ever since. And using my own definition, what I was looking for in this particular case was an engagement of cognitive skills as manifested by maze navigation and tool use, because those were relevant and appropriate for the species. And in terms of welfare indicators, I was interested to see if there was an increase in social play. So that was the thing that I was really hoping and expecting to see at the end of this challenge period. But that, looking back, was a bit of a problem. So there is this problem with using play as just the universal welfare indicator at the end. The first reason is that, of course, play is actually highly debated as a welfare indicator. We're getting emerging evidence that some animals in some contexts actually play when their welfare is otherwise poor. So it's not this magical universal welfare indicator that we sometimes treat it as. But the problem that I really want to focus on is the problem of how we've been setting up our cognitive enrichment experiments. So what we normally do is an ABA design. So this is a repeated measures design where you're watching the same animals repeatedly over time. So we start with the A condition, that's the baseline, and we'll measure something like play as a validated welfare indicator before the animal has experienced any challenge. Then we'll give that challenge to them, and that's the B condition. And what we then do is we focus on task engagement. So we switch the focus of the behaviours that we're actually measuring. And then we run our A condition again. So we're looking for whether the level of play goes up compared to the pre-enrichment baseline. So in this setup, play is the overall goal of the cognitive enrichment, and it's not being treated as the mechanism that the animal's actually using for dealing with that challenge. This means that what we're doing is we're focusing on just one type of play. We're focusing on the joyful, creative, spontaneous type of play that, yes, of course, that exists, and it probably serves the function of allowing that animal to express its joy, to be entertained, to be occupied, but it's ignoring the other type of play that does exist, which is the play that animals use to develop their skills. Connected to this is a problem of very course level analysis. This is true of cognitive enrichment evaluation. It's also true of most other types of enrichment evaluation. What we do typically is we focus on binary data points or very, very coarse levels of behaviour. For example, is the animal using the task every minute, yes or no? Does the animal pass or fail the task in the exposure? Pass or fail, yes or no? We might record or we might present total durations or frequencies on a graph, but what we're doing is we're removing all of the lovely cognitive detail and really sort of ignoring all the cognitive processes that are happening in response to this challenge. So yes, while we could look at one data point and say, relatively speaking, was the animal using the task? Were they engaged with the challenge at this particular moment in time? But so what? It doesn't really tell us much about their welfare. The reason why this is inadequate and why it's probably why cognitive enrichment has sort of stalled and it's not really moving at the pace of the rest of animal welfare science as a field is because the way that we've been doing cognitive enrichment doesn't concur with how we think that skill development, play and affective state have co-evolved. I'm of the school of thought that thinks that play develops skills, and as I've said, I appreciate there's two categories of play, so I'm specifically thinking about the type of play that does function for animals to develop their skills, and I also think that affective states regulate behaviour. So I'll try and explain the rationale behind all of this very quickly on this slide. First of all, animals do not live in static environments. They live in environments that are constantly changing, and these changes manifest themselves as challenges. And that means that animals need to cope with these challenges to survive and to thrive, and they need to be able to do this by exercising their cognitive skills. So there's a need to have certain cognitive skills. And play is the mechanism by which these skills develop. In the context of play, you can acquire, you can practice, you can learn your skills in a relatively low stakes, non-life-threatening context, and then when a real serious challenge comes along, you'll be prepared because you've practiced and acquired your skills through play. Affective state comes into this because affective state is the feedback that animals receive as they're playing, as they're developing their skills. The progression and the success will feel subjectively good, and the regression or failure will feel subjectively bad. If we layer animal welfare onto this, because at the end of the day that's what we're most interested in, animal welfare is broadly the ability to cope with challenges in your environment. And animal welfare is how subjectively that animal feels. So again, I'm in the feelings school of thought here, thinking that animal welfare is all about feelings. So if and how an animal can develop its skills affects its welfare. And that is why we need to start looking at skill-based play in the context of cognitive enrichment, instead of focusing on that joyful, spontaneous play that may occur at the beginning and at the end. Yeah, so we're going to move from spontaneous to targeted play. It's not to say that spontaneous play is irrelevant, of course it's not. And again, I talked about joy and this idea of a peak positive affective state. We do definitely want to measure that type of play and take that into account, but we really want to, in the context of cognitive enrichment and cognitive challenge, we want to start thinking about this targeted work-like play. Just as a recap then, we're going to move from the status quo, which is to separate out and delineate cognitive task use and post-challenge play. And we're going to smush the red and the blue together to make purple. We're going to think about what the animal's doing on that task as play, and we're going to start calling the task a game. This might seem a bit backwards, but I'm going to talk to you about the evaluation of a game before I talk about what a game actually is. In my head, this made more sense, so I hope this is making sense to you. But let's just imagine for now that we know what a game is and we're going to use it. So we're going to give the animal this game, we're going to expose the animal to this challenge. What we would typically do is probably just record instantaneous sampling of if the animal was using the task, yes or no, every minute or so. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to switch to continuous data recording, continuous sampling, and record each and every single game play action that the animal is using on that task. So the pushing, the pulling, the prodding, the movement, which direction it's moving, which angle, everything in great detail. And the reason that we're doing this is because those behaviours are the evidence of the cognition happening. So this is essentially how we're going to measure if and when and how skill is being developed. And yes, you can definitely lump this data together into coarser categories at a later date. The example I've given on the slide is the sort of grey-black bar is whether the animal is engaged or disengaged. So in this case, they do have a big chunk of engagement and then they disengage right at the end. Or you could look at something like progression versus regression. And then key to this is that we're also going to map on to the same timeline every single time the animal has some sort of emotional response, and we really need to synchronize our data sets to make sure that we know exactly when in that cognitive sequence this emotional response happened. I've given an example of a positive emotional response, which would be the bubble, and a negative response, which would be the jaw clap. And then as we do this and as we amass more data, what we should be able to do is use certain time series analyses to actually look at the cause-effect relationships between that play happening and that skill developing. Let's talk about what games actually are then. So a game, as per my own definition, is a rule-based challenge. This is the cognitive challenge that you're going to give to an animal. And you might be thinking, well, how is this different from any cognitive enrichment that I've ever given to an animal before? It actually could be quite similar. It depends what you've been giving your animals before, but the main difference between a task and a game is that a game is focused on developing skills, and therefore it's a lot more scaffolded and has rules, as opposed to a task, which usually, if you look at the psychology literature, focuses on just testing a skill. So we're switching our focus from testing a skill to developing a skill. That means that we need to externally construct this challenge. We need to know exactly what the parameters are. What are the rules? What must the animal do to succeed? What would the animal do to overall win? What would they do to lose? And for the player, for the animal, it gives feedback. So the animal will understand over time what the rules are. and they will be able to develop their skill. So the pictures on the left are the things that we're going to rule out as animal gameplay, because these are sort of spontaneous, creative, joyful types of play. Some people will call these a game, but they don't fit with this definition of very rule-based challenge. And then there are a couple of they've been called games in the literature, things in the literature that are interesting to look into, things like game theory games, arcade games, hide and seek being played by rodents. These are kind of the starting point. We can also look in the animal cognition literature at what we've previously used as a task, and we can apply a process called gamification to that task to turn it into a game. This involves adding things like narrative storytelling, obstacles and time limits. And these things, in humans at least, if you add these game elements into cognitive tasks, you can really increase participant engagement and enjoyment. I don't have time to talk about the natural versus functional debate in the talk, but this might come up in the questions, and we can have a think about whether it is okay to give animals highly artificial looking games, or whether it should be something more natural. And then just a very quick note on my current research. I'm working with some really wonderful collaborators across the world at the moment, working with various primate species in zoos and research centres, looking at how computerized and analog cognitive tasks could potentially function as a game, so whether they do have those game criteria into them. And our overall aim at the moment, and something that we're actively doing right now, is developing games for animals that should induce this state of flow, which is a positive feeling that's only been evidenced in humans so far, which makes it feel like time is flying when you're really absorbed in a task and you're developing your skills really well. So this is all in progress, and watch this space, and hopefully we'll have some empirical data in time for the next conference. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Fay, for an interesting take on play and how we define it. We have a number of questions here. The first one from Paul Rose asking, is gamification of tasks suitable for all species, or do you think it will only work well for highly complex taxa such as primates, cetaceans, and so on?
Yeah, great question, Paul. The answer is we just don't know. This is at such an early stage. Most of the cognitive enrichment we've done so far has been focused on the large-brained animals. So I showed pictures of, mainly dolphins, chimpanzees. There's been quite a lot of cognitive enrichment done on farmed animals, but when we started to think about things like birds, reptiles, it's completely unknown. So because we don't have that baseline knowledge of their cognitive skills, it's really difficult to think about these game designs for those taxa. So we're going to need to do a lot of homework, I think, before we could get anywhere near the stage where we could start to think about games or gamifying tasks, because we don't have the tasks to begin with.
Yeah. We are running out of time, but I will ask one quick question. Is offering a single game or task to a dolphin in a barren tank not always problematic to interpret? Should we offer more variation?
Yeah, well, absolutely. That's a massive question, isn't it? A sort of ethical and moral question as to, the situation that the captive animals are in anyway, which is kind of a separate question. The way I've always approached enrichment is to just think, well, what can we do in the environment they're in, regardless of what that is? What can we do to make it better? And if it's quite good or quite bad, we can always do things to try and make it better than it currently is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Fay, for an interesting talk and for answering a few questions. I wish we had more time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Berta.
And that takes us to the final talk of this session. And this is co-authored by our first speaker of today, Ngaio Beausoleil, and will be given by Kat Littlewood, and it's about 5 domains washing.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Kat Littlewood from AkoVet in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This work is co-authored with Professor Ngaio Beausoleil from Massey University. And many others have contributed to the thinking behind this presentation. Thanks to you four for organising this event and to everyone tuning in around the world. Today, I want to explore how the 5 domains model is being used in practice and why the way we use it matters. My central message is this: the model is a framework for structured welfare assessment, but its value depends entirely on how it is applied. The 5 domains model is now globally adopted by various NGOs, companies, and certifiers. The model's uptake has exploded across sectors, including farming, research, and zoos. It's increasingly used in assurance schemes, guidelines, policy, and public communication. It's a powerful framework, but growing popularity brings risks of oversimplification and misuse. Our concern: the model is sometimes used to appear welfare focused without robust scientific application. First off, the 5 domains model wasn't designed to deliver a welfare score or result. It's a framework for reasoning. It helps us structure our thinking and guides how we use available evidence to make informed inferences about an animal's experiences. So using the model well means gathering structured information and reasoning carefully about how the animal might experience those conditions. What sets the model apart from other animal welfare assessment frameworks is its focus on affective states. It reflects a contemporary understanding of welfare as being fundamentally about mental experience, both negative and positive, not just physical condition. This affective state orientation also aligns with public expectations. We care about whether animals are happy, fearful, bored, or in pain. The first 4 domains capture what we can observe and measure. We have Domain 1, nutrition and hydration, Domain 2, the physical environment, Domain 3, health and function, and Domain 4, behavioural interactions or agency. These domains help us provide the evidence base to describe what's happening to or within the animal. Domain 5, however, is different. It's where we infer what those conditions likely mean to the animal in terms of mental state. Things like pain, thirst, frustration, or comfort. And this is crucial for appropriate use of the model. Indicators go in domains 1 to 4, not domain 5. We don't observe a mental state directly. We infer it using evidence from the other domains, informed by species-specific science and context. So domain 5 isn't populated with measures. It's where we bring everything together to reason through the animal's likely mental experiences. This is what gives the model both its strength and its complexity. It is what makes the model so powerful, but also why it's vulnerable to misuse if people skip or simplify these inferential steps. With widespread use of the 5 domains model, we're seeing some common misapplications, often well-intentioned but still problematic. One issue is treating domain 5 as a checkbox, acknowledging it without demonstrating how conclusions were reached. Some users simply note that mental state was considered, but they don't show how that conclusion was reached from evidence in domains 1 to 4. A reminder that domain 5 isn't a label to be applied, it's an inference to be reasoned. A again, we cannot put indicators into it. Another issue is using unvalidated indicators, things that may not reliably reflect welfare in the species or context. Then we have false precision, assigning scores to mental states, which implies objectivity we simply don't have. Assigning numbers can appear objective, but it oversimplifies the complexity of animal experiences. It implies more precision than the science allows. Welfare isn't a single measurable unit. And finally, we sometimes assume specific affective experiences without enough evidence to back the inference. This is subtle but critical. We often infer experiences like frustration, boredom, or loneliness, but many of these have limited validation, especially across species. Just because we suspect an effect is occurring doesn't mean we have sufficient evidence to support that inference. Until validated, we must remain cautious and be transparent about confidence levels in our assessments. All of these errors dilute the rigor the model was designed to promote. In short, the model demands careful reasoning and humility. Misuse doesn't just weaken the assessment, it risks undermining the model's credibility. When this happens, we shift from meaningful welfare assessment to something closer to branding. We've started using the term 5 domains washing to describe the superficial or symbolic use of the model, where it's referenced, perhaps even claimed as a standard or even branding, but not meaningfully applied. The risk here is that people see the model or hear its name and assume a robust welfare assessment has taken place, when in fact the application may have been superficial or selective. This is a form of welfare washing, where inaccurate, false, or misleading information about animal care practices replaces genuine action. But it's important to acknowledge that not all misuse is intentional. In some cases, people simply don't know how to operationalize the model, especially if they're new to welfare science or haven't received adequate training. That's a call for support and clarity, not criticism. Mia Cobb did an excellent job of describing different types of welfare washing in her 2023 UFAW talk, so check out the recording of her presentation on YouTube for more detail of this concept. Whether the misuse is deliberate or unintentional, the consequences are the same. It undermines the credibility of the model and the organisations using it, and can delay meaningful welfare improvements. So our job is to offer better tools, like the protocol I'll outline shortly. It's important to recognise that the 5 domains model is increasingly being used in diverse contexts, not just for formal welfare assessments. For example, it's been applied in policy and risk analysis to explore potential welfare impacts of proposed regulations or systems changes, education and training to teach structured welfare thinking, communication and care planning to explain animal interests to carers, stakeholders, or the public. All of these are legitimate applications. The model is conceptually strong and flexible. But we need to be clear and specific about what kinds of use we're making of it. When we use the model to systematically assess the current state of an animal or group, that's best described as an animal welfare status assessment. If we're using it in a different context, for example as a risk analysis tool or an education framework, we should say so clearly. Using the right framing helps manage expectations, avoids overstating findings, and protects the integrity of the model's original purpose. Just referencing the model doesn't mean you've carried out a welfare assessment. The model is versatile, but it wasn't designed to be a logo or a catchphrase. So whatever the context, policy, communication, teaching, we need to say what purpose are we using the model for and what process are we following. That's how we preserve its scientific and ethical integrity. To support consistent evidence-based use, there is a 10-step protocol. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, Ngaio has been thinking about this for some time. We start with step 0. Clearly state your purpose. Are you assessing welfare, communicating risk, designing care guidelines? Then, if systematic assessment is the goal, the protocol guides users through 10 further steps. Steps 1 to 3. Start with good data. First, gather species-specific data across domains 1 to 4. Identify relevant animal, resource, and management-based indicators. Then propose what physical, functional, or agentic impacts these indicators are likely to result from. Without sound input data, any inferences about mental state will be shaky. Steps 4 to 6. Link to mental experiences. Infer what mental experiences these impacts might generate. This is domain 5. Sort the indicators into welfare status, actual experiences, or alerting potential risk. Distinguish between what the animal is experiencing versus what it could experience. It's crucial to be specific. Are we inferring pain, frustration, boredom? Each requires evidence and justification. Steps 7 to 10. Validate and be transparent. Validate your chosen indicators. Are they meaningful for that species, in that context? Use structured reasoning or expert consensus to aggregate mental state inferences. Assign confidence scores to show whether we're quite sure, moderately sure, or cautious about each inference. This protects us from overstatement, helps build credibility, and provides transparency. The aim of this protocol isn't complexity for its own sake. It's to encourage reasoned, transparent, and evidence-based use of the framework. The 5 domains model is one of the most influential tools we have in animal welfare science. But it only works if we use it honestly. It's not a scoring tool or a brand. It's a framework for thinking clearly about animals' lived experiences. Used well, it can drive real change. Used poorly, it becomes another box to tick. Let's keep the framework honest and use it as it was intended, to serve animals. We welcome your questions and discussions on this topic now or by follow-up email later on. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kat, for inspiring and maybe provocative talk about the 5 domains and how they are used. If you can turn your camera and microphone on, then the questions are coming in. Welcome, Kat. You're also in a different time zone than I am. I will start by saying to everybody listening that those 10-step protocol is actually listed at the bottom of your abstract. So if people are interested in reading a bit more, they could go there, of course. Yeah. So the first question is about what about stimulating the development and use of welfare indicators linked to domain 5? So vocalizations, body posture, facial expressions, and specific behaviors.
Sounds like you might be talking about domain 4 indicators.
4, yes, sorry, domain 4. Yeah.
So what's the question?
I should have read it through.
That's all right.
We'll start with another one then. You are talking about how people are misusing it. or potentially misusing it, alleging to some people, using it as a badge, saying, oh, we are following the 5 domains, and then there's nothing behind that. It's just an empty front. What do you do when, have you caught, you don't have to name anybody, but when you see this, what do you do, or what can we do if we see it? What questions should we ask?
I guess that's the issue, is like, I don't know whose job it is to call people out on that. We've tried not to do that. That's why that's why the aim of this talk today is actually to draw attention to the problem, and I guess ask what do we do next? Like, whose role is it to call people out on that? Is it advocacy groups' role? Is that something that they can do? Can they push a little harder? I have actually talked to groups that may be using it in a washing way, potentially without meaning to, and they say that oftentimes they just don't get pushed that little bit more to provide that evidence, that background behind their use of the 5 domains. So actually, can we push a little bit harder to ask for that information?
Yeah, great. Baz has joined us online because it was his question that I bangled up before. So Baz, can you please answer your own question? Ask your own question, please.
Maybe just to clarify, that there's currently more and more approaches also trying to measure the 5th domain, using vocalizations, body posture, emotion, facial expressions. How do you look at that? So is that something you would encourage, or in your system it's more like it's the end result of the other 4? I think it would be great if we can approach it even closer and make it measurable.
I think there's some confusion in that we only put indicators into domains 1 to 4. So those indicators you're talking about, they sound a lot like domain 4 indicators. So we'd probably put them in domain 4, and then we would do our inferences about, what do vocalizations mean? What's the affective state that we might be proposing in domain 5? And we draw our links across and down that way. So we don't tend to put indicators in domain 5. They're in domains 1 to 4, and then we draw those linkages down to domain 5.
Right. Thanks. Yeah.
And just a final, hopefully quick question. So you talked about people not having enough adequate training in actually using the framework. So where should they go to get that training?
That's a great question. So Christine Wilkins has a really cool training specifically for equine users. That's an Australia-based training program. I can't remember where she's hosting it through. I'm sorry. But there isn't a lot of training in the space in terms of 5 domains, and that's a recognised gap. So we are working on putting stuff together in terms of showing people how we can use it well. Yeah. But that's a great question.
Well, thank you very much, Kat, for answering the questions. We have now come to the end of the first session of today, and we have half an hour break, so we will start again. Please come back here, use the same link to log on at 10 past the hour, whichever hour you're at. So thank you very much, Kat, and see you all at 10 past the hour. Bye.